I'm working on a game called Four Humors that's going to be going to Kickstarter this summer. So, yeah.
Cool. Hi, I'm Glenn Cotter, and I'm a designer. My first game, Fickles, came out a few months ago, and I was going to say hi, Sarah. No, Sarah. Back in many proto spiels ago. Just want to say hi.
Okay. Anyone else want to do an introduction?
Hi, I just joined. I'm Connor. Yeah, I design games.
Okay, well, now it's Sarah's time.
Hi, I'm Sarah Graybill. I'm a project manager with Panda Game Manufacturing, which means I get to help people make their games. So I help people get quotes for their games, and then when they sign contracts, when they're ready to actually start manufacturing, I also help with that process, help walk game designers, small publishers, walk through the manufacturing process. I also design games and with my husband, John Schulters, and I don't do development any longer, but I have done game development in the past. And I'm also just a hobbyist and enthusiast. I love all kinds of games, but especially cooperative games and strategy games. That's kind of my jam. So thank you, Carla, for hosting these discussions and having me on.
Well, I'm so glad you're here. I thought we could start off the discussion on like little things that designers can do to maybe make their games more appealing to publishers from like a manufacturing standpoint.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to weigh in on that. And then, I'm curious to hear some of the other people that are on that have pitched their games to publishers, what their experience has been. But one thing I've been trying to keep in mind as a designer, and now even more so seeing from the manufacturing side, is just being aware of manufacturing costs. So, everybody knows that making games is expensive, but being more or less aware of how to streamline things and how to make things as cost effective or cost efficient as possible is a thing that your publisher that you're pitching to will really recognize and can make their decisions a lot easier. So a really simple example of this is cards, like poker cards. Generally, for most manufacturers, those come in sheets of cards. So when they print them, they come in a whole sheet that is, a grid of cards, and they'll print an entire sheet at a time. Poker cards, for example, come in sheets of 54 cards. So if your game has 55 cards in it, that's going to be not significantly, but unnecessarily more expensive than it would be if it has 54 cards in it. So kind of keeping those design parameters in mind, even as you're creating or developing your game, can be really beneficial. And other things, just thinking about components, thinking about dice. Dice are an expensive component when you're building games. So if you're designing your game and you have each player has 46 dice in their personal pool that they're using instead of having a common pool of shared dice, thinking about those design decisions from a cost perspective is one way to help streamline your game and also make it more appealing for publishers. One other thing I always I try to recommend to publishers when they contact us is there are some things that you can do that help really deluxify your game that don't necessarily cost more money. So like meatballs, everybody's familiar with the basic meatball shape. And one little insider secret is that making a custom meatball shape, not the Carcassonne one, but a unique one that maybe is wearing a top hat or wearing a ball cap or whatever. Those don't really cost any more than making a standard shape meatball. We don't have, buckets of those sitting around. We make each one custom individually anyway for the game. So those are some simple decisions that make your game look really polished and feel really unique, are more accessible. If there are four player colors, if each player or meeple has its own unique shape as well, that improves accessibility. And knowing those kinds of things, even as you're discussing or talking to your publisher or potential publisher can help, make those publishers make an easier decision when they're evaluating if they want to work with you or if they want to license your game. I personally had experience with that with a game that I designed called Grackles, where it's a tile laying game, and our original design was to have the game lay out into a 6x6 grid of tiles, or 36 tiles. But when we started making our own copies, or doing prototypes through the GameCraft or other things, we kept running into the fact that there weren't tile grids that were 36 tiles. So we would run into having to make decisions about cutting it down to 25 or making it only 35 tiles with a starting tile, or other things like that. So I think just more or less my general rule of thumb is to be aware of what those manufacturing edges are, what those standard products are, standard sheets of cards, or standard sizes of things, and try to design around that.
Well, that was great, Sarah. Does anyone else have any manufacturing questions or questions for Sarah as a designer or things like that?
For sure. Well, I have one. So you mentioned the fact that that custom meeple shapes would basically cost the same thing as like the standard, quote unquote. But would having multiple different shapes, would that I would assume that would increase the cost, given that it would be like different like knife edge thingy for each one?
Yeah, so what you're thinking about is a couple different things. For one, it costs nominally more if you have 10 different meeple shapes than if you had one meeple shape. We're talking a few cents per game, not a few dollars per game, that it's costing difference, depending on how many meeples you have, of course. But for the wood, in the case of wooden meeples, if it's just a standard shaped meeple that doesn't have too intricate of a design, if it's not a Cthulhu, where it's got these tentacles that wrap around and have undercuts and things like that, if it's just pretty basic design, we actually don't create a die for those. We use a lathe to cut them. So we'd create a block of wood and then kind of slice it like a loaf of bread to create those meeple shapes. So in that case, we would just create 10 or 5 different loaves of bread and cut them that way. So there's a nominal charge, at least from Panda's perspective. Every manufacturer will be a little bit different, but for creating a unique design, but it's really minimal when it comes down to the per unit cost of how it affects those things.
And when you talk about undercut, do you mean like not just a one-dimensional cut?
Yeah. So essentially, our wooden components, a meeple is like an extruded 2D shape. It's a flat shape that is, 3-dimensional. It has that third dimension. Undercuts would be, I'm trying to think of an example of one. I'll try to pull up an image here shortly of one, but it would be like if it has, a tentacle that spirals in on itself, or something that that would have to be laser cut instead of cut with a lathe, that you couldn't just cut it with a blade, that would have to have that more precision. Or like if it's got, spikes on its back and an arm with spikes on the inside of the arm, or something like that, where you have to go in with a more precision laser cut. That would be that undercut.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
I'll try to pull up some imagery for it.
So Aaron asked, is there a way to find out some of the manufacturing information that you're talking about, like how many tiles per sheet, cards per sheet, etc.?
Yeah, so one way is to submit a quote. You can do that with Panda. You can go to pandagm.com and submit a quote. And our quote tool has a ton of information on it as you're going through on card sheets. Another way to do it, each manufacturer is going to be a little different. I can post some resources, but Panda also has a design guidebook and a component guidebook that has some of that information in their guidebook as well, in our guidebook as well. One thing I will say for punch boards, for example, my game Grackles didn't get manufactured with Panda, but For the most part, punch boards are something that you would create yourself. So you're creating your own die line and your own pattern for that, your own die cut, kind of cookie cutter pattern for that. So that does have more flexibility that you could do, 36 tiles if you fit it. When the trouble that I ran into with Grackle specifically was with prototyping through the Game Crafter. So that's where I got into that, where their tiles came in sheets of 35. But with Panda and many other manufacturers that I'm not familiar with how they operate, for the most part, punch board would be something that you'd create your own die line for. So that you're not limited to tiles. You could do 12 tiles and 12 coins on one punch board.
Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
I'll ask something. So when I was pitching like a year or so ago, I noticed a lot of companies were asking questions along the lines of, is there some unique component here, something like a gimmick that you can really sell on? And I imagine there's got to be a balance there. Like if you make some crazy mechanical device, they're like, oh, that's a really cool gimmick, but it's going to be really expensive to manufacture. What would you recommend as far as being aware of the manufacturing process to say, like, okay, we want to make something really cool that's unique and unlike any other game, not the standard component, but still is very manufacturer friendly.
Right. I think that's always, me personally, and Carla, you might want to weigh in as a publisher is how you make those decisions. But I think being aware that most custom components, especially as related to plastic, which is where you're going to get those really unique components, like Wavelength, right? Their little device that has the sliding window and the dial and this really cool device that holds it all together. That was a really precise custom vision that they had, and that generally, as related to plastics, you're going to be incurring tooling fees, mold fees for creating those custom injection plastic pieces. Unfortunately, there's not really a way to know what's possible until you ask your manufacturer and say, hey, here's my vision, here's my harebrained idea, tell me what's possible. And most manufacturers will be able to talk through that idea with you and say, what is the most essential part of this design that is a deal breaker, and what parts can you be flexible with, and what's your price point that you're thinking? Because then we can help kind of figure out the best way to approach it by addressing those questions. But I would say in general, there are some ideas that that may seem really crazy that aren't that crazy. And I think just being ready to have the discussion, but going into it with some flexibility in mind is the best approach. That would be my perspective.
Yeah, from a publishing perspective, whenever anyone has a like weird component, like it has to super need to be in there. Like you have to have a good reason to have the weird thing in there. Otherwise it will get taken out, especially
Right.
for like small publishers like me, where like I don't want to do mold fees. Like when you're making a lot of games, mold fees, like they cost less per game, but like I'm making like maybe 5,000 games a print run. So yeah, I definitely need to get the cost down. Connor asked, are there any common component requests that you get that people think would be simple but actually aren't?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'll have to maybe see if I can think of some other ideas, but the first one that comes to mind, at least for me, is magnets or magnetic components. I get a lot of requests for those, and in general, Panda tries to stay away from magnetic things. We have magnetic boxes, and that's a little bit different, but magnetic components that stick together, other things, just because passing safety checks becomes more challenging when you involve those. They're expensive, they're heavy, there's just a bunch of factors to consider. So it's not a 100% deal breaker, but for the most part, we try to really be careful as we're thinking about magnets and try to stay away from them where we can and think about other ways to solve it. Magnets are things that have been done in toys. You see those magnetic stacking tower pieces a lot, but in games, it's just starting to be explored. So I would say that's the first one that comes to mind. I'll try to think if there's anything else, but magnets is one that people are really excited about that we just don't really have a lot of comfortability manufacturing just yet, fortunately.
So I had a follow-up question, if that's all right.
Sure.
You mentioned you have magnetic boxes, so that was actually the next question I was going to ask. Was like, what about not custom boxes, but like slightly different boxes? Like I'm thinking about the game Sabotage, where it's like hidden information. The box like folds out and it has to be this big thing that can separate the two.
Yeah.
Like, is that going to be a showstopper if I'm pitching a game to a publisher, or if I want to have magnets in the box edge to do like something fancy like that?
Carla can definitely answer what her, if that would be a showstopper for her. I imagine her answer may be similar, that it would have to there would have to be a reason for it. But, magnetic boxes is definitely something where you can let that creativity happen. In Charterstone, there were magnetic boxes inside the main box, that held the legacy components, or we've done a couple of boxes at Panda that kind of look like wardrobes that pop out. I don't have, let me grab mine. I can grab it in a second here, but that have magnets that pop out and the doors kind of swivel open. And absolutely, it's a really stunning effect that comes with a potentially premium cost, depending on how many details you want in there. But it could be, I think it's really impressive and it looks really amazing, but I think it kind of has to have that functionality behind it or a reason to exist from my perspective.
Cool, thanks.
So yeah, from the publisher perspective, again, like if you have a perfectly good reason and like it makes the game really cool and stand out, that's great. I've done magnetic boxes before, and those aren't too bad. Like even at smaller manufacturing print runs, like I did it at the game I made 5,000 copies of, and the box is really cool, and that's great. But just make sure that your game is like really good. Like the higher cost it is, like if I wanted to make that, like publish that game, I'd have to like really think that I could sell like 3,000 or 4,000 of it.
Yeah.
Because I'd want that higher print run to combat the higher cost. But like for other games, I might still sign them, even if I think like, oh yeah, this will probably only sell like maybe 1,000 on Kickstarter. Like, you just have to, like, for each added component and the larger cost, you have to have a better game.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks for that.
Here's the box I was talking about. So this was one of our sample toolkits that we did a few years ago. It's this kind of vertical stacking box, and it has these wardrobe style hinged magnetic compartments within that then had check boxes and other things inside of them. So you can see that's a pretty unique design, and I think it would fit the right themed game. Like you could see a vampire game, or something like that, existing like that. And it's definitely gimmicky, but in a pretty cool table presence way. But as Carla said, definitely the more you make of them, the more cost effective it's going to be. If you're only doing 1,500, that might cost $2 or more per unit just for the box itself. Whereas that cost comes down as you're making more copies of the game.
Like one thing to consider, like if you want to do like a crazy box, maybe go more generic on the theme. Like making the game appeal to more people means you can sell more. But if you want to do like some crazy component and also some crazy obscure theme, those two things probably don't jive well together.
That's a really good point, Carla, that you want the more of the wackier the component, or regardless of box, probably the more expensive component, you want it to appeal to a broader audience. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective, but that's really a smart approach.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I was thinking about it in terms of theme, but like also in terms of like families and stuff. Like don't make like an 18 plus older game that is also has weird components, because that market is also, well, it depends on what it is, but it tends to be less large than like the family market or the like 2 to 4 player audience.
Right.
So any other questions on manufacturing or in game design in general or anything?
I have another one. And maybe Carla, you can also share your thoughts on that. One thing that I'm preparing for a Kickstarter this summer, and one thing that when I was sending in my request for quotes to manufacturers, one thing that I sort of had a panic attack over was box size, because it seems like there are like literally infinite possibilities, and like, is everything going to fit? Is everything going to be like too tight, not tight enough? Is it going to be like a standard fit to go with other games on the shelf and in boxes for shipping, stuff like that? So what kind of what do you think should go into that decision, kind of, I guess, is my question.
Carla, I'd love if you can kind of go into your perspective of what you use as your metric for determining box size, and then I can talk about it from when I see quotes come in. I can talk about that and kind of how we do all those checks that you mentioned. But Carla, I'd love if you start just from your perspective of how you make that decision.
Okay, so one, it really depends on the price, because the consumer has this big idea that like the box should represent the cost. So even if the components would say one cost, like even if there's like if it's just cards, if for some reason like there's a lot of art or something like that, you might want a bigger box because the box represents the price. So that's the first consideration. Right now I have 3 box sizes. For small games, medium games, and large games. And how I came to these 3 box sizes is that I went around and I looked at different boxes. What the goal was that I chose a box size that another company had chosen. So for my big box size, it's the same box size as Costa Rica, which is by Rio Grande, I believe. But it was also the same box size as Race to the Galaxy. So those are games that people know, and they might already have on their shelves. So like if they bought my games, they could stack them and it would look good. So for my small box size, I did the same thing as TMG does for their small box size. And just if you need more space, you could change the height of it. So that's how I came up with like my 3 different boxes. I just chose, like, I went through my my catalog or not catalog, my board game collection, and I was like, which box size do I like the most? Because like especially small box sizes, there's infinite, and you don't want to be the one person that has like just like slightly off so it doesn't stack, because people will just not like it.
Or where it's just a little bit too wide for a shipping box. And
I generally don't care too much about shipping boxes, because all the flat rates at this point are expensive. Like it's just more expensive to ship in a flat rate than it would be to ship in like there's different regional rate boxes, or to just get a bag and bubble wrap is a lot cheaper, because so I personally don't care about that. But I also do fulfillment with Amazon, and Amazon is cheaper than flat rate. So yeah. But yes, make sure that it fits in. Like if you are using, like if you're doing a Kickstarter and fulfilling it via flat rate, make sure it fits in the right one, because the next tier up is, lot.
From a manufacturer's perspective, I would say, that's the biggest things that we look for is, one, is everything going to fit, and is there going to be too much space? Are we going to have a Splendor effect where somebody opens the box and they're like, there's only, this many tiles in here. Why is this so big? And I think Carla's absolutely right. At least from a consumer perspective, like I expect, the Days of Wonder boxes, those are all uniform. They're all the same size. And I kind of expect a certain quality or enjoyment value that comes out of that regarding components, and that part of that is related to box size. If they suddenly make a really small box, a box that's this size, I know I'm going to be in for a different experience, and I wouldn't expect to pay $50 or $60 for a box that's, for a game that comes in a box that size. And, delivering that larger box can help. But working with your manufacturer, hopefully whoever you worked with, whoever you submitted quotes to, can help guide you and advise you on the box size. And I would say, even if you're submitting quotes kind of blindly, you can put a note that says, I'm not sure about this box size. And somebody like me, a project manager, or somebody from the company that you're getting quotes with can come back to you and advise on a box size that'll work. At Panda, and I'm sure a lot of other manufacturers too, one of the things that we do when we check the production is check to make sure everything fits, and we'll have you do that. So at Panda, we deliver what's called a pre-production copy of the game. Essentially, before we hit mass production, before we hit go on printing everything, we send you a full color copy of your game. And we will have sent you other sample components previously or at about the same time. And then we ask you to, one, play the game, make sure everything looks good and feels good, and then also pack the game up, and make sure everything fits in the box. Because once you manufacture 5,000 copies or 3,000 copies and you find out it doesn't fit, that's not the right time to discover that. So, we'll help advise as best we can, and then we also ask that you make sure all of that fits, or that the things fit in there with card sleeves on them, or other things like that.
And what about inserts in this whole discussion?
So inserts, the two basic types of inserts are cardboard trays or plastic trays. So generally, custom plastic trays are designed to fit within your game. So they're custom made based on the size of your box, and then other specification based on you. So if you tell us it needs to have 4 compartments, because I want one compartment to hold the cards and one to hold the wooden pieces and one to hold the dice, then we'll kind of create that, send you samples of it so you get a sense of how that fits in the box and how it fits. So we can create that customization based on whatever your needs are, essentially.
Okay. Thank you.
There was a question from Jack who asked, do you have antimicrobial or whatever, you know what I'm saying, materials, or like cardstock, or have you looked into them at all? Has there been an uptick in requests or inquiries about them?
I'm sure that it is something that is on people's minds. I personally haven't seen those requests start to come through yet. It's not something that I'm familiar with from what Panda can offer, but it's something that I thank you for your question, Jack, and I could probably get back to the people in this group with an update on that. It's not something, like I said, immediately that I'm aware of, but it might be something that people that starts to become more of a material that people are inquiring about now in the age of COVID-19. I think that's something that people might care about, or people, the other thing is people might there might be an uptick in sleeve sales so people can wipe down their cards, other things like that. I imagine that we might start seeing that start to become more commonplace.
Yeah, I know. I definitely plan on having, for all my demo copies, like when I'm at a convention, is to have them all be sleeved, because you can wipe off sleeves,
right,
and it's a lot cheaper to do that than like if somebody sneezes on a regular copy.
Right.
Oh, and to go back to the insert thing, from a publisher perspective, I just let the manufacturer, I just tell them whether I want like a paper insert or a plastic insert, and I haven't even said anything, and they just send me back a thing, and it's like, do you want this insert? Does this count? And they just do the work, and that's what I like, because I'm not good at CAD or
sure. And with Panda, it's the same thing. If people really want a specific design, they can use CAD or use a 3D design program to design a file for us. They could also just tell us the basics, this is what it needs to hold, and we'll come up with something. They could give us a 2D drawing. Generally, when you want something really precise, you want your game's name printed, imprinted 3D embossed on your tray or something like that, that's when we'd need a file. But otherwise, if it's pretty basic, that's something that your publisher, Panda or otherwise, can probably come up with that design themselves and would show you either pictures or video or physical samples, so you would be approving it blind necessarily. And I see a question from Eric about being careful with plastic. I'm assuming he means plastic trays. That consumers will complain about sleeving cards. Yeah, we've definitely seen that, and we've started advising, at least it's something that I'm aware of, and I've started telling people to maybe try to build their trays with that in mind, so that they can hold cards sleeved or unsleeved. So it's definitely something that we can advise on and help, make sure that it fits regardless of if it's sleeved.
Yeah, making sure it works for both sleeves and not sleeves is kind of a headache, but you're gonna like, you don't do one, then like you're gonna have so many angry people.
Yeah.
Oh, and like I made sure that my game fit with sleeves, but then I forgot to check like all the like extra deluxe components or mini expansions and stuff like that. And apparently, like if you got like the extra meeple token, like fancy meeple tokens for Fire in the Library and the fancy big cards, the big cards fit in the box, but they didn't fit with sleeves. So
yeah.
I did not think that all the way through. So your Kickstarter like stretch goals, like all of them have to fit, including with sleeves.
Including with sleeves. And actually thinking about sleeves, that's a really good thing to recommend, is that people make card decisions, not only based on how many cards they can get per page, per sheet, but also, is the card size a really common card size? There may be templates, there may be sheets that Panda offers or other manufacturers offer that's a really unique card size, but that isn't common enough to have sleeves readily available. So just being aware that half or some percentage, I don't know what that is, of your your consumers are gonna want to sleeve their games. Think about making your cards as standard sized as possible. And Panda has, like I said, a bunch of different sheets, but we put notes in there that says, this one's a standard poker size, this one's a standard tarot size. That way, hopefully that's a little bit of that nudge that one's a more common one. Yeah, Eric, leverage the Mayday sleeve chart. That's right. They have a really good resource for their card sizes with sleeves.
Oh, I did not know that. I have to go look that up.
I had a question about, have you seen any innovations on timers, like beyond sand timers, and or like electronic timers that would be cheap enough to have like a bunch of them in a game or something like that?
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure what you're looking for innovations, but Panda has sand timers. There's kind of the standards, flat bottom sand timers. We also have a custom one that we made that you don't pay tooling for. It kind of has this cool geometric design on the top and bottom. And those can be customized, the color of that, of the caps on either this custom one or a regular one can be customized. The sand can be customized, the color of the sand, the quantity of the sand, meaning the duration of time, can be customized as well. Electronic timers, generally, for many manufacturers, I imagine that they would source them from someone else, from an existing timer that already exists, that we're not creating the electronics ourselves. But I don't know how many timers you're thinking of using. It's not as inexpensive as meeples, for example, but all in all, it's pretty cost effective. Sand timers are. So I would say just get it quoted out. But is there an innovation? Is there an idea that you have that?
Well, I've seen a few games lately that use sand timers as, like worker placement components.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah.
They're just a little bit awkward to
flip
see around and flip around if there's a bunch of them on the table. So just trying to think of like other.
Yeah.
Yeah. other options?
Yeah, I mean, it could be that you can kind of customize the design of these caps that go on them, but just be aware that with anything that would be plastic customization, that means creating a mold for it. So having mold or tooling fees that you would need to be ready to invest in, meaning maybe make a lot of, either a lot of sand timers or, several copies of your game.
I'll ask. So since you've been on both sides of it, you've been a designer and now you're in manufacturing, is there anything that has informed you now that you've done manufacturing that makes you want to go back and design or anything you would do differently now that you've had this experience?
No, not necessarily go back and do differently, but I think it just gives me a really interesting perspective as far as, making sure that when I design something, I haven't been working on too many games recently, but for my own personal designs, but that just really being cognizant of that, that every custom piece you create, is going to have a cost associated with it. So, but I think it is really interesting knowing kind of this side of it and knowing the manufacturing side of it and going back and thinking about publishers and why they have custom or standard box sizes or other things, for example. I think it just changes the way I think about design. But kind of that stuff I was talking about at the beginning of the call is just making sure that you really think about those decisions and, recognize that having 1,000 cards in your game is going to be a really expensive investment, so kind of knowing those kinds of things.
So Eric asks, any thoughts and advice on acrylic tiles, such as in Copenhagen?
Ooh, custom acrylic is something that's really cool. You can there are acrylic components that you can kind of treat like wood components, acrylic meeples that get cut in the same way, kind of that lathe, loaf of bread style. I haven't seen the acrylic tiles in Copenhagen, but I think that they're kind of like the Blockus tiles, right? They're kind of those polyomino shapes, I think. Those would not necessarily, and then they're silk screened also. So, those aren't necessarily going to require a mold because they're probably just a thin sheet of acrylic that's been cut either with laser cut or lathe cut. That's definitely an option. I don't know that it's, depending on how many tiles are needed, adding silk screen is a cost, but a small cost. So it's definitely something that I think could be really cool. And I'm starting to see that more. I've seen a couple other games that have that acrylic, either full color printing or silk screen printing on it. And it's a really neat effect when it's done well and done right.
Do you know about the cost difference, between if you were going to do acrylic versus wood?
Yeah, for like meeples, for example, it's slightly more expensive to do acrylic, but not much, for something standard like that. And it which is kind of funny for cubes, 8mm cubes is actually the inverse. So 8mm cubes are slightly cheaper than 8mm wooden cubes. But when you start to get more materials, it's really just the materials cost at that point, and acrylic will just cost a little bit more, at the larger the piece is.
There's a question from Eric. Recommendations on minimum GSM and cores for cards you are holding versus cards you are not holding. I imagine also holding probably means more shuffling and.
Right. So there are 3 kind of standards. There's and every manufacturer might reference these slightly differently or have different stocks, but Panda's standard is 300 GSM blue core card. So it is a cored card. It's a really nice weight poker card. and playing card. But then the next upgrade from that you'd be shuffling a lot, handling a lot, passing back and forth would be an ivory core card. So it's a little sturdier. It has kind of more of a snap back. If you were to bend the card, it'd kind of have more of a snap to it, be a little sturdier. That's an upgrade that I think is really good upgrade to do for like a Kickstarter stretch goal or other things where your card is a little sturdier, holds up to wear and tear more. I think if you're going to sleeve your cards, the sturdiness of it is probably not, you could probably get away with a lower, the blue core. The blue core is still a great quality card, but that ivory core just provides that more sturdy if you're holding cards. And, like a werewolf type game or something like that, you might want more of that card that's going to be able to be held and manipulated than, something that just gets passed or stayed on the table or something like that.
Where does black core come in?
Black core is still the same, so it's also 310 GSM. It's still the same weight as the ivory core. It's just got it's actually between the two sheets there, and it's good for like games where you really don't want to see through the card at all. So I don't know if any of you have played Just One. Just One does not have cord cards, or at least not black cord cards. So in just the right light, you can actually see through the card on the backside and read what's on the front. But a black cord card would prevent that. It would be, completely opaque. Even up to light, you won't be able to see through it. Ivory cord is pretty well solid, but black cord just provides that extra security.
Jack asks, what was the most recent game component that made you say, wow?
I don't know. That's a tough one. I mean, from a player, I think this isn't something that Panda made, but I think the device for Wavelength is pretty cool. That, that spinning dial, it's got a few of these cool moving parts. I think that's pretty cool. I think the other thing that I've seen in a lot of games recently is just the innovations with cardboard and how cardboard is stacked or interlocked. So in Everdell, they have that cool tree platform, or some other games where they have folding boats or other things that all stack together. One component that Panda makes that I just really love is dual. So people have seen dual layer cardboard mats that have a tracking grid, so you can move your cube to track your inventory and you don't have to worry about it sliding off because it'll have a little nestled spot. That's pretty cool and is starting to become more standard. But BoardGameTables.com created this game called Bites that has dual layered punchboard tokens. So it has a little apple that looks like it's got a bite taken out of it, or it's got a little wine droplet that looks like it's got some dimensionality to it. And those are really, really cool pieces. And they were just very satisfying to punch out. I really like punching cardboard, punching punchboard, and it was very satisfying to punch those out. So that piece was pretty neat and pretty innovative. But Carla, from your perspective, have people been pitching games that have really interesting, or have you played anything recently that has really standout wow moments?
I think the last component that I really liked was from Wingspan, with just like they have all the custom like little the holders for all the eggs and the actual eggs themselves, and just like before I knew that dice tower that was in there was punchboard, I did not know it was punchboard.
Right.
Because just it's such a high quality thing that like I played with it like somebody else's copy and I thought it was plastic or something, and then I bought a copy of Wingspan and then I was like, oh, I had no idea that like Pitboard could look so good.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that people are thinking about those things now and thinking about how to construct those things for a really neat effect.
Eric asks, with regards to plastic, how are mold costs calculated? Size, different color plastic components?
Yeah, so a couple of different things that you're talking about there, Eric. Molds, the cost for molds and the amount of molds that you need is determined based on the size of the miniatures or the piece that you're creating, and the complexity. So, minis that have a guy holding a sword and also a shield in his other hand, and, all these different complexities might need to be several pieces that get assembled at the factory together to make it as intricate as it is, and that will impact the mold cost. But also, this doesn't impact the mold cost, but does impact the per unit cost. If you have, 20 different minis that are all the same color versus 20 of the same minis that have, 5 green, 5 blue, 5 red, that impacts the cost too, because we have to reset that mold every time to inject those new colors in there. So color and complexity and size is definitely all factors that go into the cost for plastics.
Again, with the cost of plastics and stuff, is there an increased cost, like when you want to put in sparkles, or like what are other things you can put in there?
Yeah, so you could do, clear plastics or solid, kind of that gray standard PVC type. There for dice, there would be increased costs if you want to do marbled or swirled of different colors, or glitter, or metallic colors, other things like that. I haven't seen too many plastics that have glitter or something in them, but personally, just me as a project manager, but it's definitely something that I think we could explore and would probably, nominally increase the per unit cost, the plastics cost, but not necessarily the mold cost. That wouldn't relate directly to that mold or tooling fee.
And why I ask about that is acrylic stuff is sometimes a lot harder for accessibility for colorblind reasons. But
right.
if you're doing blue and purple acrylic and one of them has sparkles in it,
has sparkles, right?
Then that's colorblind friendly.
Yeah, that's definitely something to explore. And there might be some acrylics, talking about player pieces, meeples or something, for example, where you wouldn't necessarily be paying a mold fee, that might have that glitter or sparkles or swirl option. So it's always something that, even though I don't have the answer right here, that our team could explore, by seeing what's possible.
Jack asked, what's your minimum print run requirements? 2,000
units. So that's where that cost effectiveness starts to kick in, is right at that, right around that 2,000 unit mark. So that's with plastics or without plastics is 2,000 units.
So any other questions, either manufacturing or game design, or even life related? How expensive is it to print on transparent cards?
So those would be plastic cards, and those costs are all determined by the design of the cards themselves. So we actually need, at Panda anyway, we need the design of your card, or a rough, it doesn't have to be final, design in order to quote it, because it's not just about the sheet, but about the ink and the design that goes on top of it. So the answer is, I don't have a good answer, because it's totally dependent on the size of your cards and the design that you have, the art that would be going on the cards.
So would it be more expensive to have a larger area of color and stuff going on?
Yeah. More expensive to have a larger area of color, and more expensive than paper. More, a deck of 54 clear, plastic cards is more expensive than paper cards, but I don't know the ratio of how much more expensive it would be. But it's not as cost effective as doing a traditional, blue core, even ivory core card would be. But it sometimes can have a really cool effect, right? Like the Gloom game, or I've seen other stacking games where you're layering cards, and it has a really cool effect. So I think as more and more people design with it, I think we'll start to see it. That price might change, might go down, because we might have new efficiencies. But I'd love to see it more in games. It's really neat.
So that's really gotten my mind going from a game design perspective. Would it be better when you're doing clear cards to have one central image, or like would it be more expensive if you had like imagine like the same amount of color on a card, but like in one blob versus in like 5 different blobs?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. I would have to check. My instinct is that it would, that if it's roughly the same quantity, that it wouldn't, those would be roughly the same cost, those 2 scenarios, but I don't know. I'd want to learn more. So you have me going from a manufacturing perspective. I want to take a deep dive into plastic cards.
Yeah. I mean, they're really cool. I know what Gloomhaven, or no, not, well, you said,
Gloom. Mystic Veil did it, right?
Yeah. So, and I love Mystic Veil.
Yeah.
So, other questions? Other things going on with people? There was a question above. How is coronavirus affecting manufacturing?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it did hit Chinese manufacturing and factories in July and February, but at least for Panda and many other manufacturers that I've seen, they're recovering really well and might be at full capacity. Many places are at full capacity or nearly full capacity again. So for right now, there's some busyness and some projects that they're working through from the times that we were closed, but for the most part, factory operations are normal or very close to normal. Where we might start seeing, and I haven't even really seen all the full effects yet, but might start seeing some challenges is related to shipping or warehousing, other things like that, where shipping is just slightly delayed due to so many shipments going out around the world. And then in factories in warehouses and fulfillment or distribution, just as things in the US are, might be at various stages of skeleton crews or other things like that. So that's an area that I personally am paying attention to, not just from a manufacturing perspective, but from a designer perspective. So it's something to be aware of. But for right now, manufacturing, from everything I've seen, Panda or otherwise, is still, going strong and still functioning really well.
Yeah, from a publisher perspective, like we've already hit, like as you said, in January and February, that was, well, every February is bad.
Yeah.
So it kind of hit at a good time, actually. But yeah, manufacturing's doing great. The thing that's not doing great is like I was fulfilling a campaign right before this, and it's just gone to a complete standstill because the fulfillment centers are. So I anticipate for my next game being able to manufacture it perfectly fine, getting it on a boat. Once it gets off the boat, then we'll run into issues because there's all this shipping issues and all that. So yeah, there will probably be delays getting games to people in the future, but it won't be, I don't think, from a manufacturing perspective.
Right.
There was a series of questions. So does a site like the Game Crafter get close to the actual cost of a game?
From my perspective, yes and no. Yes, they get very close to the cost, or do really well when it comes to making 10 copies of your game or 100 copies of your game. But if your game costs $20 or $25 to make a single one-off prototype to get it to you, your actual manufacturer cost to make 2,000 copies of the game will not cost that same $20 or $25. It would be significantly lower than that because we're buying the paper goods and the box materials and everything at such an economy of scale that you benefit really from that better pricing all around. It's very hard to say the ratios again because it's so dependent on game to game. But Carla, from your perspective, I don't know how you make your prototypes, but when I was designing games, I would design a card game, a 2-deck, 108 card game that would cost us, $20 or $25 to make a prototype of it. But I'm sure whoever our publisher wanted to go for manufacturing, they were probably paying $1 per unit or, less, depending on how many copies of the game they made. I'm not privy to their costs, but my guess is that manufacturing it probably only cost them $1 or $2 to make each copy of the game and not $20 a game.
Yeah, well, you said it might be cheaper to make 100 copies at the Game Crafter, and I'd say it really again depends on the game, like you said. But if you're going to make 100, you might as well make 1,000 in China, and it will probably be cheaper to make 1,000 of something in China than to make 100 in the U.S.
Yeah.
And better quality. Because the Chinese manufacturers really know what they're doing, and they do it really well. Not to say that the Game Crafter is bad, but they are good at making a few copies.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's probably more restrictions with the Game Crafter, right? It's been a while since I've used them, but you're kind of a little bit more restricted into using their existing box sizes or options or other things like that. Whereas with a manufacturer, you have a lot more flexibility. You can have your box be, millimeters different from other people's boxes, and it's fine. Everything's completely customizable. So, yeah.
Well, and accuracy,
right.
The accuracy of the Chinese manufacturers is so good compared to the accuracy.
Right.
It's for prototypes, it doesn't matter. It's things I'm super nitpicky. So I notice it, but would a regular consumer care? Probably not.
Right. For your copies that you give to reviewers, are you using a service like the Game Crafter for making those high quality prototype copies, or what's been your solution for that as a publisher?
It depends. I'll usually get the cards made from a print on demand. I like print and play because they're so much faster. But I've gotten dice manufactured in China because you have lots of dice over there, and it's a lot cheaper, and I can get the color I want. But working with the manufacturer, I got the dice made at the manufacturer that I've been using because we have a relationship, so they can get me things that you might not otherwise get just because we have a thing going on and they want to support it.
Right.
So making that connection and asking questions is the important part with all of that. But sometimes I even make boxes because boxes are I have access to a laser cutter, so I can make a box and it'll look good enough because the prototype copies don't need to be fantastic. Right. They just need to exist.
Yeah, they need to exist. They need to convey information, but
I've even considered getting cards printed at FedEx or Office Max because you can buy these if you do a card stock, you can get a card the thing that makes the edges, and you can
the corner.
And that's so much cheaper and also a lot faster. The Game Crafter can take a month or a month and a half to get your cards back. So
I'm not sure I understood that corner thing.
So cards have a rounded corner, and you can just get a thing that will make a square corner. Okay. And people can't always tell the difference between the cards. I could because I'm super passionate about card thickness at this point in my life. And I bet Sarah could tell, but would average player or average designer be able to tell that this card is different in some way?
Right. Especially if you sleeve it, it becomes even harder to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Even the cheap penny sleeves, it's really hard to tell.
There's lots of questions now. Are there any resources you recommend for getting an idea on how much a game will cost to produce?
I think the best resource would be just to submit a quote with Panda or Longpack or other manufacturers, because that's the most accurate way. Rules of thumb can only get you so far, and For the most part, I would guess that many manufacturers are hesitant to provide any cost estimates without really knowing the details of what's going to be in the game. So usually it's pretty fast. With Panda, it takes about 2 weeks, hopefully less, to get a quote back, and would be really customized for your game. You could start with the Game Crafter and see that price and go, hey, I know that this is $50 to make at the Game Crafter or Print and Play or Board Game Makers, and know that that is going to be the very high end, that your game at 1,500 or 2,000 units is not going to cost that much. But to get that scale cost, the easiest way, I think, is to submit a quote.
Yeah, I agree with that, because you should have like a spreadsheet of all your components anyway, and
Right.
just sending it off, it doesn't take that long to get it back. To get a real and you'll kind of be amazed at the cost of different things. And usually manufacturers break down what costs the most. It's usually a line by line thing, which is really helpful to you to know oh, this part that I didn't think cost that much actually costs a lot more than I thought it did.
Yeah. At Panda, we don't itemize our quotes like that, but we could include other options. So if you say in your quote or send a note to your project manager after that says, hey, I want to see what the box is like if I add spot UV to the top of the box, and I want to see what it's like with a linen finish versus a standard matte finish, and we can include options like that. So you can actually be surprised to learn hey, adding linen finish only adds 8 cents per game or less or whatever, depending on how many cards. And I think that is a really good way to get that perspective to know, hey, these premium features that, I've seen other people use as stretch goals are actually pretty dang premium because they, add the correct price, or not as premium as I thought they were.
Aaron asks, by accuracy, do you mean bleed cut margins? Yeah. So whenever I've submitted files to China and they've made a game, they cut exactly where it should be. I don't really have to care about the bleed because it's exact. But when printing it Game Crafter or Print and Play, those margins are very much needed because it can be all over the board.
And I don't know exactly what machines the Game Crafter is using, but my guess is that it's probably related to that machine accuracy, that it's not just human quality control that's doing all of that. I think that's certainly a factor, but I think it must be related to the type of machine that's being used. Because I think Game Crafter uses digital printing, but I'm not sure what other types of printing machine they have. But that would be my instinct.
Okay, well, it's 8:00 unless somebody has a last minute question or anything. Glenn, when printing expansion cards, how hard is it to get an exact match? And I'm assuming you mean when printing expansion cards at a different time, say a year or two later.
Yeah, that's a great question, Glenn. So that's absolutely something that you'd want to tell your manufacturer as you go back and get that expansion. Ideally, you're using that same manufacturer. If you're switching manufacturers, it's a lot harder to get that exact color match because you need copies of the files and the game itself, physical copies of the game. But for somebody like Panda, that's something that we have built into our procedures. So we would just note as we go through that color proofing process that it needs to have precision color matching to the previous version of the game. And then for the most part, it's pretty dang accurate. I'm sure that there have been errors that can sometimes feel a little bit like Multiplicity, that movie where he's making a copy of a copy of a copy, and eventually you get the guy that's I like pizza, the really far removed from the original. But for the most part, if you have that really good original to work on, and that's the one you're using every time, you get really good precision color matching. And being, just telling your project manager that's an essential part, then we can pay extra attention to that and make sure it happens.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sarah, for being here, and for everyone else for asking questions and listening. and everything else. I put the link for our Discord in the little chat thing so you can join and, help us decide what the next chat will be and who the next guest is and everything. So thank you all for showing up. It was great.
Thank you. That was really fun. It was great to talk to everybody.
Yeah.
Great questions.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome. Bye.
The next one is Sunday at 2 p.m. CST, and then we always meet Sundays at 2 p.m. and Thursdays at 7 p.m. CST. So,
yay. Great. Bye, everyone.
Bye.